But the hardest thing for me, and I think any pastor can relate to this, and pastor's wife as well, kind of takes it very personally, is when people leave the church. But that's been the hardest thing for me. I don't think I wear anything in my heart more than that. And they always say it's not personal. Don't take it personal. It's like, personal? I'm the pastor of the church. What do you mean don't take it personal?
Hey guys, you're listening to The Glass House hosted by Lifeway. We are Ben and Lindley Mandrell, and we have conversations with leaders who have experienced the stress of ministry and have sensed a spotlight on their personal lives. We want to encourage ministry families and provide a glimpse inside their glass house.
Today on the show, we have Dean and Krissie Inserra. Dean is the founding pastor of City Church in Tallahassee, and they talk to us today about anxiety and fear and how that has played out in their life.
In this episode, Dean explains the series of events as a pastor and a church planner that exposed a struggle with anxiety. Krissie gives even her account of how she is affected by Dean's struggle even today. One of my favorite parts of this episode is the moment when he shines a light on why pastors often take things personally. You'll want to listen to that. Dean and Krissie, thanks for being on the podcast. It is such an important opportunity for us to raise issues that pastors and pastors' wives are going through. When Lindley and I were in local church ministry, we know that there's a lot that pastors deal with, that their families deal with, that a lot of people don't understand or see. And we want to continue to bring some of those things to the surface. In a previous conversation we had with you, we were impressed by your vulnerability in talking through a struggle with anxiety. I would guess there's a lot of pastors just with all the stress of ministry that struggle with anxiety, but probably confess to be real about it. And Dean, we'd love it if you'd be willing to share a little bit of your story with anxiety. So kind of where did it start with you?
Yeah, it really did not start until I planted a church. I mean, I remember just growing up and through middle school, high school, college, I never had any anxiety. When people find out oftentimes that know me that I have anxiety, they're surprised because like, oh, I just kind of thought you were just full speed ahead and nothing bothers you. And, these type of things. And it's not some kind of fake personality I have. Like, thankfully the anxiety doesn't debilitate me. Like I know people that weren't able to get out of bed or off the couch because of how much it dealt. I haven't gone to that lengths yet, but just more of a lingering just presence, in my life since I became a pastor. And when I planted a church from scratch with 20 people in my parents' living room 14 years ago, it's one of those things where the first couple times that I started having these moments, I thought I was having a heart attack. Here I was at the time, like in my 20s. I'm like, what is going on? I mean, I'm not the best eater in the world, but I'm not the healthiest eater on earth. But I'm like 25, 26, through my 20s. And all of a sudden I'm having this serious, all the symptoms. So I went to the ER.
We went 2 or 3 times in 6 weeks.
Yeah, thinking this was happening, going, they're just wrong about something because I know I keep going and then they send me home afterwards, but this happened again. And it wasn't like it was continuous. It would be one night I'm sitting on the couch and it happens. One night I was holding my son and I just handed, he was baby at the time, and I handed him to Krissie, our oldest son, and I said, I gotta go to the hospital right now. And I even drove myself. I was able to function, but I thought I was having a heart attack. So I went in there and they did all the normal things you would do with someone that they think is having a heart attack. And they, a couple hours later, they sent me home. And after the third time, they told me they just said it's anxiety. And now when it happens, I know what it is. So I know, and I've learned some things and some techniques and just coping things that had to kind of come back down. But it's just one of those things where I still to this day, and I've gone to counseling and things such as that for it. But it's one of those, I've been on medication, off and on for it. It's still just one of those things where I still don't quite know how to not have it come.
Yeah.
I know what to do when it happens, but then it just kind of comes on me. I also know that some of it's, I do believe some of it's spiritual. It's a control thing. I know that's part of it. Am I going to, do I really believe in the sovereignty of God? Do I believe it theologically? Yes. Do I believe it in my heart? I hope so. And so I know there are some spiritual things there, and I also do believe there's some clinical as well. So I kind of deal with both, because I don't think any anxiety is just by itself for me that comes.
Yeah.
I think it's the control stuff, because where it comes out a lot of times are when it comes to things I can't control.
That's good.
That's where it becomes a reality
Krissie,
for me.
For you, how do you sense this is going on with Dean, and maybe he's not taking it seriously?
I know for you, you just you can see you tense up. You can the breathing changes a little bit. And so it's more, and I know it comes up in situations that he can't control. I mean, even things like being a passenger in a car or being on a plane, even little things like that, or just when it looks like, we don't know what's going to happen. COVID is happening. What do we do? Do we have church? And so I mean, I can tell when it's kind of coming. I don't always know what to do.
Can you almost see it before he sees it? I mean, sometimes I say to him, like, are you okay? With different things, because I almost can recognize symptoms before he recognizes it.
I think so. I think so. And it's been so long since it's been the full-blown emergency room deals that sometimes I forget that that's probably what's happening. And he's, because otherwise you'd be like, are you just tired? Or, but no, it's, yeah.
I think it's an interesting conversation. Both of my parents went through severe depression when I was in my college years. And so I know I have it in my DNA I got to watch it carefully because it's just part of my family history. But I almost, when Lindley talks to me about, are you depressed? Are you feeling down? I get defensive about it. Like, what do you mean? Like, I'm just having a bad day or whatever. So I don't know that we as men are very good at being real about how we're really feeling.
Yeah. And I think I might feel guilt sometimes too, bringing it on to someone else, where I don't want to have to put this problem on Krissie or on the kids, or not even understanding that actually they're receiving the problem, whether I want to talk about it or not. So yeah, I think that can be a thing for me. I think sometimes too, maybe a frustration with expecting people who don't deal with it. It's one of those things where I know it's almost cliche to say you just don't understand, but like you really don't know. It's kind of like being a senior pastor. If you're not a senior pastor or never been a senior pastor, you just don't know what it's like.
All right, let's hit pause right there and talk about this situation. You mentioned in that clip that sometimes I don't know how I'm coming across, or you experience me in a way that I'm not experiencing myself. It made me think about times when I've come home from eating Mexican for lunch, and you can tell
And you smell like an onion?
Whoa, where did you eat? I don't smell myself, but you're smelling it. I think with anxiety, often I'm carrying it. I don't even realize I'm exuding this aroma of anxiety or tension. How do you experience that with me that maybe I don't get it. I don't see it.
Well, when you talk about being defensive, what I notice ahead of time is that I know you so well. We've been married almost 20 years. I know your personality. And so when I see you doing things like you walk faster, you walk harder, like you're like stomping on something, you are, you'll talk to yourself. You'll text fiercely, like you're kind of punishing the phone by like knocking the keys really hard, or your computer, like I can hear you typing from another room, like you're just pounding the computer. And so I know at that point that what I know is that you're hiding something from me to protect me because you're feeling anxious about it, and you don't want me to know it. And so you're carrying the burden on your own and not wanting me to deal with it. But I know it. I see it.
I feel defensive even in this moment. I feel like I want to put a positive spin on that. I feel like I want to say that's just the competitive nature in me. That's the me that brings out the best in me. And I have a personality that wants to put a silver bow on everything and not call a spade. But when you experience that, and when you're around me, it feels uncomfortable.
That's because I have the personality that calls a spade. And let's just go ahead and tell you what I'm seeing. And you have the same right to do that for me.
I think this is one of the challenges of being a spiritual leader in the church, or a pastor or a church leader, is that when you have people constantly encouraging you or giving you kind notes or affirming you, and then you come home and your spouse gives you a different diagnosis, it's jarring. The pride in me wants to rise up in self-righteousness and say, you're being unkind to me. That's not how other people experience me. When those other people don't feel the same level of comfort in being honest with me like you do. That sincerity piece in marriage is hard, but so needed.
Okay, so I have a question for you. Dean mentioned shame over his anxiety, and you mentioned just defensiveness. So tell me what that's about. Tell me the difference in your mind.
It's about embarrassment. I'm a little humiliated that I'm anxious because I'm supposed to be strong for you. I'm supposed to be strong for the people I serve. And, I read the Bible and it talks about being a rock and, having strength. And anxiety feels like weakness. And so I don't want to be weak. I don't want you to see me as weak. I want to be strong for you and for the family and for the church. And being anxious feels like you can't trust me anymore because I'm vulnerable and I'm weak and I need to be Superman.
I feel like, though, in your weakness is when the Lord's strength rises. So that's, for me, the hard part, is that when you try to be Superman, and I feel like it's almost pretending, like pretentious, then I don't feel like the Lord's getting to use his glory in your life because you're trying to steal his thunder.
Having had a season now of being out of the weekly pulpit, it gives me a chance to look back on how I functioned in ministry. And there definitely was something there on every Sunday morning, just feeling really sweaty and intense and anxious. I would come home from church, as you know, just exhausted because I was carrying this anxiety or the stress of I've got to control this room. I've got to control how people are experiencing this worship. I've got to make sure everything's where it needs to be and I'm ready to go on all my parts. And so much of that really is just walking in flesh and not in the spirit. And it can suck the joy out of being in the presence of people because you're trying to perform for people or control circumstances that are beyond your control. And I see that more clearly now than when I was in the weekly pulpit, because I shouldn't have been that exhausted in preaching. I should have enjoyed it more. And that's because I wasn't aware of some of the anxiety that was playing out in my life.
Obviously, COVID was high anxiety for pastors and pastor's wife, and Dean and Krissie had some interesting things to say about how it affected them and their church.
It was tough because he was real tense, and we didn't have our church. Now, thankfully, we still had our community. We would still, the office, after probably about a month or so, the office was able to be open, and the county allowed us to, gather and at work. And so, I would a lot of times just take the kids and go up to the office and see staff members. And, but as everybody else experienced, the first time we had somebody in our home that was not related to us was probably 3 weeks in. And it's a friend who we consider family, who we always have over. And there was almost this can we do this? Can we do this? And I almost felt sick at just that thought of being scared to be around people. But that was the reality at the time. And so, it was, so that kind of that lonely isolation combined with just what he was dealing with, it was hard. Yeah.
How have you understood the difference in anxiety and depression? How do you recognize the differences?
Anxiety for me is kind of feelings of more kind of panic attack or high heart rate or just really kind of internally freaking out. When I've studied depression, I don't think I've never had scary thoughts, that need attention. I've never had, I've never been debilitated where I couldn't get out of bed or, along those lines. I know there's different phases or different levels of it. But for me, I think I just kind of had more sort of situational at the time. And it was, just really just sitting on Sunday morning and that our service being online, I didn't even want to watch it. I wanted nothing to do with it. I'm this is not how things are supposed to be. This is not how church is supposed to be. Where I think that may have come from me being anxious about the future, which goes back to, Jesus in Matthew chapter 6, talking about worry and anxiety in the future and how God cares for the birds and he isn't going to care for us. And just having to remind myself of those things. But that got me anxious. We're going to have church again. And I know a lot of pastors were thinking that, is this, we knew nothing. A month in, it's what is happening? We're all told we have to be home and our churches are shut down. And we're pretending we're really having church online, but we know it's not really church. It's just what's going to happen?
And there was no end in sight. Yeah. And
so one thing that we noticed with our friends who are pastors, and typically senior pastors do like things in their control. That is kind of a common metric among all pastors, is that the reason they've started a church is because they have a way they want to do a church their way. That's right. And so I think the hard thing with COVID is that their way didn't really matter anymore because it was beyond their control. It was mandated by government. It was mandated by mask. People even within the church didn't agree on the mask rule. And so it's just a really high anxiety time as they're trying to figure out how to keep things in their control, but when it's all out of their control.
It has been a mess. It's just been so messy. Pastors have felt like the whole thing is out of control. And our friend Charlie was talking about how even the metrics pre-COVID were thrown away into the trash. And he uses the 4 B's that pastors use to measure themselves of success, which are buildings, budgets, baptisms, and butts in seats. As long as I'm hitting on all those cylinders, I've got a good building that's full of people. I'm hitting budget. We're baptizing folks, and man, people are showing up and filling the seats. I'm doing a good job as a pastor. Well, COVID took all that away.
Well, I think what was interesting in what he said about that is that those aren't even. He talked about how the pastors could be unhealthy. All those metrics could be high, but the church really could be unhealthy with that. And so when COVID hit, the true health of the church showed up.
And the true health of the pastor and the pastor's wife.
That's right.
We now had to deal with who we really are outside of the programming.
Mm-hmm.
And you and I have talked about this. For the last 2 years, we've been out of the weekly treadmill of creating the worship service that happens, Sunday's always coming.
Mm-hmm.
And when you live on that adrenaline rush like pastors do, you don't have a lot of time to stop and tend to your own soul and say, okay, what is my identity really founded in? And that's where anxiety comes from, I think, for me, is when I forget that my identity is in Christ, that my relationship with the Lord, that vertical dimension is so important in my life, and I just start paying attention to all the horizontal.
Mm-hmm. You said programming. I think even just the personal success. I mean, that's where the attack begins. I feel like in a lot of pastors during COVID is that their personal success felt attacked because when their churches don't come back like other churches are coming back, they're wondering why isn't theirs growing? Is it them? Is it their style of worship? All those things.
And I've watched you, Lindley. I mean, for 2 years now, we've been out of the identity of pastor and pastor's wife, and I've watched you really go through a season of asking all those core questions. Who am I apart from what I do at church?
Right.
And it's a process that is humbling, but we all have to walk through it.
Sure.
Job-related stress is not just something that pastors struggle with. Everybody in the church struggles with that, and we're constantly getting feedback about how we're doing at work. I do think senior pastors sometimes struggle with the feedback they receive, and Dean had an interesting story about one day a staff member had something to say to him.
I mean, no time where anxiety came out, not in a temper way, where I just was like I was done for like the day and the next day. It was really hard. I had a staff member I had a really good relationship with, and just like one of my favorites. We're not supposed to play favorites, but we have favorites, those type of things. And one day, this is years ago, she walked in my office and like gave me this list of like everything I was terrible at. And like everything she was mad about and everything she thought stunk about the church and like everything wrong that I was doing. And I was just like, holy cow. And she walked in, to her credit, she locked in with her boss, on staff, me, and just like looked me in the eye and laid into me too. So she had a list and she read it and it just laid into me. And I did not see it coming from 10 miles away. I thought we were like, like great and in sync, and that I felt the same way about her, or she felt the same way about me. I felt about her, kind of staff member. And I just remember the effect that had on me.
That's happened to me. I resonate with the story.
Yeah, it was so bad that like my assistant at the time knew that it happened because like she could hear it. I just listened. I mean, I didn't have anything to say back. Usually I can get defensive in those moments. I had nothing because I was just so shocked.
You're just kind of devastated.
Yeah. And she liked, my assistant, to her credit, she like texted like 5 or 6 people that know me and like had them like reach out and encourage me that day and those type of things. But I came home and I don't know if you remember that.
I
was just
clearly
like,
remember that.
Yes. Oh my word. So that was just like,
and you were like a boxer that just went through several rounds. Like you needed a couple of days to just mend.
Yeah. So instead of more anxious, I think I was just defeated, and that can bring about anxiety because it's like, oh my gosh, does everybody think this? What happened? Is she going to leave too? No, am I going to need a new person in her place? Like, does she talk about this to the people? Like, does the whole staff think these things about how terrible of a leader I am and all these other kind of things? It was brutal, man. But I think that I'll never forget that. It's like 7 or 8 years ago.
Yeah.
Those are great
and I will
stories.
never forget that. Yeah.
We resonate with those stories, and we've experienced that. I think what's difficult in those moments is you begin to dream in your mind that it's not just this person speaking, but she's representing a growing and large group that's going to take me down.
Oh, yeah.
And this fantasy begins to be built in your mind of your fall because people are joining forces against you. And I've had to come to Lindley several times and just say, this is how it feels to me. And she'll say, is it one person?
No, he'll exaggerate, like the whole staff is mad at me. And I'm like, well, who's the whole staff? That's not the whole staff. That's like 2 out of 50. I mean, but it
People
just in
are
his
saying,
mind felt like very exaggerative.
It's hard. Sometimes if we don't let people speak in to keep perspective with criticism, it begins to be all encompassing and defining in our lives rather than just good feedback to try to learn from. It's hard.
Oh, yeah. And it's this thing of where, how do you balance between, hey, part of being a leader is just dealing with it and dealing with criticism and kind of suck it up buttercup sometimes, right? That is what we have to do sometimes as a leader. with also the humanity side of things. Like, I feel horrible right now, and I feel worthless right now, and, and I feel hurt and defeated and question everything that I ever thought I was good at. All these type of things. There's like this interesting kind of both worlds that are realities for us as leaders. Like we have to like lead the charge, but at the same time, like, I guess that's where the kind of leadership limp people talk about comes in. I've had to be honest about this. I just came home and like I was just done.
Yeah.
But I also knew that I had a church that I had to go back into that she was a staff member of, who I still think they're warm up to this day. And she wanted relocating with her family, moved out of town, but it was brutal.
Okay, there's a couple of things there that I think unpack, and one is Dean talks about this disaster fantasy that he allows to play out, that a person is saying this, a person is upset, and now maybe this person represents a large tribe of people that feel this way. And then, pastors begin to imagine all the people aligning and forming this group. They're going to take him down. I think pastors struggle with that fantasy because it could happen to them, and they've heard it happen to others. And so in the ministry home, sometimes we are trying to evaluate how big is the critical voice. And I've not always been healthy about that.
For me, as a pastor's wife, I had to get to a point to where there was a lady who would continually tell me, I need you to know what so-and-so is saying. And I got to a point, as I got a little bit older, that I said, if you can't tell me who it was, then I don't need you to tell me, because that is you're just continuing on a line of gossip. And I want to be able to go to that person and say, hey, I know that you're saying this about me and I want to clear it up and let's talk about it. Because maybe I did do them wrong, but I can't do anything about it if it's just coming around. And so that was a really healthy thing for me as a pastor's wife, is just to stop it and say, if you cannot tell me, then don't tell me any of it.
I think some of this has to do with your personality type. I tend to get fixated on certain things. Lindley and I had a friend years ago that said, you remember this, whatever you focus on gets bigger.
Sure.
And for me, my temptation constantly is to focus on that one or two negative voices that I need to silence them, change their mind, work with them, massage this relationship, when 97% of the people may feel like it's great. And it puts you in this place where you're now trying to control the uncontrollable. Right. You're trying to change what's unchangeable. And that's been, I think, a struggle for me over the years. And I could sense Dean struggle with that too. I think self-pity is an addictive drug. When someone criticizes you, you fall into this cycle of self-pity, and you keep feeding that with every piece of information you can find to verify what this person has said. So as I've done that with you, that lasts for about 30 seconds before you put a stop to that and say, hey, you're not thinking straight. You're now creating a narrative that is based on untrue things. Mm-hmm. And so it's been hard for me at times. I've not always been receptive to you breaking the cycle of self-pity, but it's what I've needed.
Well, that's not always been the case. There have been times when I know that you truly have been hurt. And I've had to learn in my personality, because I am a challenger type personality, to say, I'm really sorry you're going through this. And I know that this was a really hard situation. And even those words are hard for me to say, when sometimes what I do want to say is, okay, but time to get up and get moving again. But sometimes you do have to sit in it. And I understand that. So, that's been a balance of trying to figure out, when is it self-pity and when is it really pain? And the helpful thing is to sit in it a little bit and hear what God's trying to teach you through that pain.
One of the quotes that we've always loved is from Gary and Betsy Rikushi, when they say that one of the gifts of marriage is a full-length mirror. Here is what it's like to really live with you. And I think the challenge of being married in the ministry is that God has given you this person that's giving you the feedback that you need to hear. Mm-hmm. But often we want to look through the distorted mirror because it somehow feeds that egocentric view of myself, that I need to take on this criticism. I need to take this personally, when it may not be at all an accurate depiction of what things are really like. And I think this is why pastors need relationships. And they need people speaking into their life who love them, and not for what they do or produce in the church, but can say, hey, what you're saying right now doesn't ring the bell of truth with me. Because we do tend to surround ourselves with yes people.
Well, and I think pastors' wives need the same thing, because personalities are different for everybody. And so even for me in our counseling journey, I can pride myself on being black and white and really direct and strong-willed. But one of the counselors, what he told me was, it can also come across as self-righteous. And that was a really it was a really great counseling session when he told me that, because nobody wants to be self-righteous. And so it helped me to understand, like, well, that's not a fun personality to be around. And so strong-willed people can be really fun, and they know what they want, and they go for it, but that's also can be really hard to be around. So I needed to learn that balance with Ben of when am I being self-righteous and when am I being truthful.
I remember that moment in counseling. I was sharing something that was really hurtful, and
I gave a really good answer to why it was hurtful.
And he said to you, Lindley, that was completely right and completely unaffirming.
Yeah.
And we both laughed.
Yes.
And I do think that's what is difficult in marriage sometimes, is that we want to give the person what we think they need.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes they do need grace and mercy and encouragement. And so that's the dance. And we're constantly stepping out.
Sometimes they need the truth.
And sometimes they need the truth.
I think more of the things that could affect the family is like just negative things happening church-wise. And it just makes me just like really depressed or sad, or just want to go through like, the hardest thing for me, and I think any pastor can relate to this, and pastor's wife as well, because I know it takes very personally, is when people leave the church. But that's been the hardest thing for me. I don't think I wear anything in my heart more than that. And it's not even some kind of like loyalty freak or think they owe me anything. It's not that. I'm just a guy, right? But people that like I'm really a hometown pastor, people who are my friends, people who have helped us start this church, and all of a sudden they leave, and the reasons they give are always just ridiculous. And so, and at least in my eyes, and they always say it's not personal. Don't take it personal. It's like, personal? I'm the pastor of the church. What do you mean don't take it personal? It's like, it's like, I'm not going to I don't think I own a restaurant. I'm a pastor, but I'm not going to your restaurant anymore because I think these 5 things are bad about it, but no offense.
Right.
It's like, what?
Right. Yeah.
And let me speak to that. According to Lifeway research that's coming in, 75% of pastors, one of their main struggles is the lack of commitment among the church members.
Oh, no doubt.
It's
hard.
It's high anxiety for pastors at times in wives when you're giving everything to this thing. You're pouring all your heart and soul in it. And then people can kind of opt in, opt out as they want to. And it hurts because you want them to be as passionate about it as you are. And it just sometimes doesn't happen.
I think in so many times too, if they would have talked to you ahead of time, like a proactive conversation, and just said, hey, this is something we're struggling with, it probably could have been dealt with.
Sure.
But they get so worked up and so upset, and then they leave, and you're like, we didn't even know. Like, we didn't even know this was a problem. So that's what's hard too, I think.
Yeah. And I know it can affect you, as well, because, that's because we started the church together.
Right.
We're the original two, that started the church, and it can be hard, and probably like, and another thing, I don't want to dump too much on her, because I always joke, like, if I want to punch Bob, that doesn't mean she needs to punch Bob. It's not that I'm keeping things from her. There's just certain things that, like, I don't want her to want to beat up Bob too, kind of thing. I want to, how I kind of handle those kind of things is anything she asks me, I'll always tell her. I won't keep anything from her. But like, I'm just not going to go home and be like, so Bob's the worst, and I can't stand Bill, and that type of thing. So we try to be careful with that kind of stuff, just to kind of keep I want you to love your church.
Right. And
too.
I do. I love my church very much. And there have been times, where he'll have something happen and I will take it just as personally as he does. And he can move on the next day. He can have a conversation, and maybe I don't have the conversation, or it's just a little bit harder for me. And I'm like, well, now I'm just going to be mad at this person for a while. And that's not healthy, and that's not good. So he's really, really good about that. And I think I've realized when I need to ask and when I don't need to ask.
I think too, as the wives, we don't have the opportunity sometimes to have the clearing conversation.
Yes.
He'll have a hard conversation. He'll come home, tell me about it. And then a couple of weeks later, they have the conversation to clear the air, but I don't have that opportunity.
Right.
So it's hard. It is hard to move on when you don't really get to be in the room. Hey, one of the things that Dean said that we both went home and talked about so much was that he said, when people leave your church and say, it's not personal. Well, he kind of laughed about it, and that's about all you can do, because it is very personal. It feels personal. I mean, we have several stories about that in our 17 years of pastoral ministry.
Absolutely. Church is personal for the pastor. I mean, we put all of our heart and soul into the church, and we do take it personally. We've had a situation where one guy heard a sermon illustration that I was telling and was convinced that I had done some investigation on his personal life, and I was using him as an example. And I found out he left the church, and I called him and I said, man, I heard you left the church. Why have you left the church? He told me that he did not appreciate me using him as an example. And I just told him, I said, brother, that story was not about you. And yet he just left the church. We've had other situations where people who have walked for years with us in ministry in deep places who we found out through the grapevine, they've moved on to another church. Didn't even send an email or a text or a phone call. We just found out they're now attending another church. And it always hurts.
The family that he's thinking about specifically, we know them well. They've been in our home. And I wish they just would have told us, hey, something really upset us and we decided to go on. That would have been easier to swallow than just the wondering and the silence. I
think one of the greatest joys of being in local church ministry is it does feel like a family. There's an intimacy with a spiritual connection with people that's so close, and it's like a special bond. But the level of the joy is also the level of the hurt, because no one in your family says, hey, don't take it personally, but I'm never coming back. Well, that hurts because I care, and I care about you. And I'm shocked that you don't care enough about me, that you would even come and talk to me about that. And so I resonate with what Dean is saying. Is like, it hurts every time one of the sheep decides to move on because you care about those people. One of the joys of working at Lifeway is our research sheds light on trends in the church. And we've recently done a massive study on the well-being of pastors and what are the greatest needs of pastors. And the loudest statement we heard is that pastors struggle the most with the lack of commitment among church members. 75% of pastors said, I am deeply burdened by the apathy that I see in my church members. And what they're really saying is, why doesn't everybody care about it as much as I care about it? Or why don't they show up? Because we've worked all week on this, and I look out and, it's a thin group this Sunday, but on Facebook and social media, they're clearly very active in other things. And so it's really hard not to take that personally, as if what I do doesn't matter or what we're creating here isn't special enough to make the time to attend. And it hurts.
These have been personal for me too, just because you do get connected to people, and you do begin to love them, and your friends do become family. And when people come to us and say, hey, this is a decision we've made, it feels hurtful, but it's not harmful. Like when they just leave, it's harmful. Like, because you're like, what? It's unknown. So that's like one thing that I think is the difference. And I wish people would be more just genuine and say, we appreciate what you're doing. This is not the direction that we want for our kids to go, kids ministry wise. So we're going to find a different church. Well, okay, well, that's hurtful because that's my program, but it's not harmful.
And so when people leave the church, what pastors hear is, you are not enough. You're not enough. And I'm going to go find someone that is enough. And that hurts us to the core, because we want to be enough. And yet we're reminded in Scripture that who is sufficient for these things? Nobody can be the perfect pastor. Nobody can be enough for all the people who need you to be enough. And until you really kind of run out of your own power, you can't experience God's power and realize that it's Christ working through us that makes a difference, not us filling in all the gaps. In each of these emotions that we are experiencing anxiety today, we have to steward that emotion. We have to figure out, okay, God has allowed me to feel this. How do I best respond in a way that honors and glorifies Him? And Dean and Krissie, they had some good things to say about this.
So I think it does look different for everybody. There's some people that probably need to be like on serious medication and serious counseling. Others can learn how to manage it. And I think anxiety can be managed. Mm-hmm. So for me, that's kind of what it's been for us, is me just trying to find ways to manage it. And the most important thing for me at home is really just more that Krissie just understands that I deal with that. And like, I'm not going to let it wreck the house. I'm not going to let it, control our family. None of those kind of things. But like, just sometimes I just need to just take a break, or just need to go breathe for a minute, or just need, and she's been fantastic about it. She just understands that these are things that I deal with. And it's more, I hate to say it comes with the territory, because I know every pastor doesn't deal with it, but I do think there's, and I'm careful, I tread lightly how I say this, but I do think for pastors, there really is spiritual warfare involved. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I'm one of those people that always believed in spiritual warfare, like that it was a thing, that it was like biblical, but I thought it was kind of reserved for like my charismatic friends, or, like Pentecostal friends. I'm like the least Pentecostal person like on earth. So like, I just thought it was one of those things where, but as I talk to other pastors, they've described things and it was the same stuff. like things that happen and things that come into your mind and things that linger and those sort of things. So I'm aware of that. That's helpful because I've tried to. One thing that's been wholly helpful for me is I listen a lot now to the Bible, like instead of reading it. I do both. But a lot of my Bible reading I do for my sermons and just prep and just reading in general. But in terms of my devotional, I just decided this year, I've never done it before, just listen to the Bible. That's nice little music behind it and all that. And that's been really helpful for me just to hear the Bible read to me. And I usually do it in the car. I usually do it when I drive. I usually when I get ready in the morning. And if I'm not finished yet, it's a McShane, the Robert Murray McShane reading plan that I'm on. And then I'll listen to it in the car. And it's just, I'm not rocking out to any kind of music, driving into work in the morning. I'm just listening to the scriptures. That's been really helpful for me. And my whole point in saying this is I think everyone just kind of has to find their way to manage it.
What is a passage of scripture that you can think maybe comes to mind that has helped you on this journey, that a story from the Bible or a verse that you've memorized it, it's helped you, it's been your medicine on the day when anxiety was growing? What's that been for you?
For me, the first one that comes to mind and comes to mind often, and we hadn't started the church yet, but this is totally unrelated. I mean, it's sort of related. When our oldest son was born, there were some complications and there were some scary, scary possibilities. And just the verse, I had memorized it in high school, Philippians 4, I think it's Philippians 4:7 or 4:8, where it says, "And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus." And I understood that for the first time as, okay, my understanding is telling me something very scary is probably about to happen. And I know that regardless of what happens, God is good. And this is what his peace feels like. And it's not me just saying, oh no, everything's going to be okay. That's not the peace of God. The peace of God was looking at exactly what was about to happen, what we thought was about to happen, and saying, okay, God, you're going to walk through it with us. And so since then, that verse, as we go through times, that are just a challenge or that, we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, that verse comes back. And it's amazing that it comes back right when I need it. And I probably don't share it, but that it just keeps running through my head. And I'm like, it transcends understanding. What I'm thinking about is not making sense in a rational mind, but God's with us. It's not God's going to make it better. It's God's with us.
That's really good. How about you, Dean?
For me, Romans 8, where it talks about what can separate us from the love of Christ. And then the whole chapter, starting with there's no condemnation for those who are in Christ. I got to camp there in my mind often. But then it's exhaustive. He gives us this list of all, he's like, can nor death, nor, and he names all these things. And my favorite part is when he says, nor any other created thing. As in case I missed anything, in case I left anything out. It's kind of like on your job description or any other assigned tasks or whatever it says, that they include on there. It said, or any other creative thing, but none of these things can separate us from the love of Christ. And that's a biggie for me.
That's great.
And I'm trying to pass it on to others, believe it for myself. That's been the game changer. That whole chapter, especially when he locks in on that list, like in the late 30s, after he tells us in verse 31 that if God's for us, who can be against us? And how that's understood in the fact that there's no condemnation for us.
Thank you guys for being so honest and vulnerable. Ministry families are in a glass house. It feels less lonely in there when there's other families that are going through the same kinds of stuff. So your openness about your struggles and your challenges throughout your ministry with anxiety, I think it's going to help a lot of people. So thanks so much.
Absolutely. And we love it too. We love our church. And we love the ministry. And I've caught myself before saying things like, sometimes I'm like, man, it'd be nice just to pastor a 100-person church, and not have to deal with all this. But guess what? I have a neighbor pastor who pastors a 100-person church, and he's dealing with the exact same things.
Yeah.
So it's beyond church size, it's beyond location, it's beyond, it's all of us, and he and I are allowed to help us sit down together, two completely different churches, and be able to be united in the fact that, hey, we're trying to persevere and fight the good fight.
And I love what you said earlier. No one understands pastors like pastors, pastors' wives like pastors' wives. So with this podcast is for those people who live in that house, who struggle with these issues, and they don't know who else to talk to about it. But your story today is going to help a lot of people. So thanks for being honest. Thanks for sharing.
The Glass House is a production of Lifeway Christian Resources. It's hosted by Ben and Lindley Mandrell, executive produced by Joy Allman, produced and edited by Angie Elkins, original music by Robert Elkins, and graphic design by Cameron Spooner.
Thanks for listening to The Glass House, where we hope to shed light on the dark places of ministry, one conversation at a time.